The machine was sitting at the edge of the lot where nobody had bothered to drag it closer to the crowd. It was a 1987 Allis-Chalmers 160-grain auger with a broken shear bolt, a seized drive shaft, and a crack in the hopper that somebody had patched once with J.B. Weld and then apparently given up on. The paint had gone from orange to a color that had no name. The auctioneer, a man named Darrell Pratt, who had been calling sales in Coffee County, Tennessee, for 22 years, had listed it under miscellaneous equipment on the back of his sheet and set the opening bid at $20. He did not expect a bidding war. Most people who watch stories like this scroll past without ever subscribing. But if you've ever been underestimated, talked over, looked past, or dismissed because of how young you looked or how little you had with you, stay with us. Subscribe. This one is for you. It was the third Saturday of March 2019. The Kellerman Estate auction was held on a piece of flat ground off County Road 47 in the southeast corner of Coffee County, just past a cattle guard that had been loose since the Clinton administration. The morning had come in cold and was not improving. 41 people had showed up, mostly men between 50 and 75, most of them in coveralls or canvas coats. Most of them holding coffee in styrofoam cups that had come from the same folding table near the barn. There was a smell of frost and diesel, and something damp burning somewhere past the fence line. Darrell Pratt's voice carried over all of it without effort. There was one girl. She was 17. She was standing at the far edge of the crowd near the tire pile, not quite inside the group, not quite outside it either. She had on a green barn jacket that was too large for her, and boots that had seen real use. Her name was Maren Hollis. She had come with her uncle, Dale Hollis, who had gone to look at a set of disc blades near the equipment shed, and had not come back yet. She was standing there alone, holding a small spiral notebook and a pen. And she was looking at the Allis-Chalmers auger the way most 17-year-olds do not look at grain augers. When Darrell Pratt reached the miscellaneous lot and got to the auger, he described it in the same tone a person uses to read from a grocery list. 12-inch diameter, 30-foot length, tow-driven, needs work. 3 or 4 men glanced at it and glanced away. One man said something to the man next to him. They smiled. Not cruel, exactly, just the sound of grown men finding a busted piece of equipment unremarkable. Nobody bid. Darrell Pratt waited the way auctioneers do, giving the crowd room to feel the silence and decide they didn't want to be responsible for it. The girl raised her hand. One of the men in coveralls, a tall man named Keith Borman, who ran 600 acres of corn and soybeans in the northern part of the county, looked over at her and then looked at the man beside him. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Maren Hollis bid $25 for the auger, and nobody bid against her, and Darrell Pratt said sold in his regular voice without slowing down, and moved on to a set of fence posts that got more attention. Walt Presley saw it happen. He was 68 years old, had been farming since he was 19, and had driven down from his place in Rutherford County that morning because he'd heard there was a Massey Ferguson 135 in the equipment lot, and he'd been looking for one for 2 years. He didn't know the girl. He didn't know her uncle. He just noticed the way she was writing something in her notebook after the bid, and then he noticed she wasn't writing the price down. She was drawing a diagram. He filed that away and went to look at the Massey. The auger was not worth $25. Or so the math said on the surface. A new 12-inch 30-foot grain auger in 2019 ran somewhere between $1,400 and $2. $200 depending on manufacturer. This one was 32 years old, had a seized shaft, a cracked hopper, and a missing shear bolt. The J.B. Weld patch on the hopper would not hold grain under load. The drive chain had visible rust. One of the bearing housings had a chip in it. To most people at that auction, it was scrap steel worth the weight, which at 2019 scrap prices came to roughly $18 if you hauled it yourself. They had looked at it correctly, as far as they went. They had stopped looking before they got to the tube. Her grandfather's name was Raymond Hollis. He had farmed 280 acres in Coffee County for 43 years, mostly tobacco and row crops, and he had kept a notebook for all 43 of them. Not a ledger, though he kept those too. A notebook. Blue cover college ruled, the kind that cost $1 at a pharmacy. He filled one a year, recorded what he planted and where, what the weather did, what the yield came out to, what he paid for equipment, and what it cost him to keep it running, and what he would have done differently. He died in January of 2016. Maren was 14. She had been following him around his operation since she was 8 years old, and for the last 3 of those years he had explained what he was doing while he did it. Not his lessons, exactly. More like talking out loud to someone he trusted to listen. She listened. She did not always understand in the moment. But she wrote things down too, in her own notebook, a habit she had gotten from him without either of them naming it. Raymond Hollis had strong opinions about grain augers. He had written 6 pages on them in 2008 after he'd replaced a worn-out Westfield with a used Farm King he'd bought at auction and rehabilitated over 2 winters. The main thing he had written, the thing Maren could quote without opening the notebook, was this: "The tube is the only part that doesn't wear. Seize up the drive, crack the hopper, strip the threads on the adjustment collar, all of that is a parts problem. If the tube is true and the flighting is intact, you have a machine. Everything else is a list." She had stood in front of that Allis-Chalmers auger for 4 minutes before Daryl Pratt reached the miscellaneous lot. She had looked at the tube from the top opening to the discharge and found no visible deflection. She had reached inside and run her fingers along the flighting, the spiral metal blade that moves grain up the tube, and found it solid. No gaps, no buckling. She had written 2 measurements in her notebook. She had estimated the replacement cost of the seized shaft at $60 in parts from a Napa in Tullahoma, the hopper repair at $40 if you used the right epoxy and backed it with sheet metal, the shear bolt at $4, the chain at $32. She had written $136 in the corner of the notebook page and circled it. Then she had bid $25, and she had been the only one who did. The men nearby had found this briefly amusing. Keith Borman had said something to the man next to him. He didn't say it loudly. He wasn't trying to be unkind, exactly. He just didn't believe a teenage girl in an oversized barn jacket had a reason to be bidding on a grain auger. He was wrong, and it would cost him, though not right away. Walt Presley did not buy the Massey Ferguson 135. Someone had gotten there before him, and whoever it was had paid $4,200 for it, which Walt thought was $400 more than it was worth, but decided not to say. He drove home to Rutherford County, and he thought about the girl with the notebook. And 2 weeks later, he mentioned her to his neighbor, Ray Cochran, who had an operation in the county north, and whose daughter had gone to school at Tennessee Tech with somebody who knew Dale Hollis's wife. That is how small counties work. Walt didn't have anything specific to say about Maren Hollis. He just said he'd seen a girl at the Kellerman sale bid on a busted auger that nobody wanted, and write something in a notebook right after. And that it had stuck with him in the way things stick when something quiet happens that doesn't have an obvious explanation yet. The auger took Maren Hollis and her Uncle Dale 6 weekends to put right. Dale was not a mechanic by instinct, but he was careful and patient, which is most of what the job required. They pulled the seized drive shaft and soaked the bearing housing in penetrating oil for 4 days. The shaft came free on the 5th day. They replaced the chain with a number 50 roller chain from Tractor Supply, $28. 47. They pulled the shear bolt, which took longer than it should have because the bolt had sheared flush and had to be drilled out, and replaced it with a correct grade 5 bolt, $0. 89. They cleaned the flighting with a wire brush and found one small gap near the base of the tube that Dale welded closed on a Sunday afternoon in April. The hopper they did in 2 stages. First, they ground back the JB weld and cleaned the crack with a wire wheel and acetone. Then, they cut a backing plate from 18-gauge sheet steel Dale had in the shop and riveted it in place. Then they applied a proper 2-part epoxy rated for metal-to-metal bonding and let it cure for 72 hours. Dale hooked a hose to it and they filled the hopper with water and waited. It held. Total cost of materials, $134. Total cost including the auction bid, $159. A comparable used auger in working condition in Coffee County in April 2019, a 12-inch 30-footer, was listing at $800 to $1,100 in the classified ads. They had not bought one. They had made one for $159 from a piece of equipment the rest of the crowd had collectively decided was scrap. They moved it to Marin's family's property, 83 acres her mother had inherited from Raymond Hollis and been renting out for row crops, and they put it to work during the 2019 corn harvest. That fall, Keith Borman's grain auger broke down. It was a 2015 Brandt 1545 he had bought new for $3,800, and it had done something to the drive gearbox that his equipment dealer in Manchester could not diagnose over the phone. He needed a replacement for 2 days while they figured it out. He had asked around. He rented Marin Hollis's auger for $60 a day. He did not know at the time that it was her auger. He found out later. He did not mention it. She didn't mention it either. Here is the part that matters. The 83 acres Marin's mother held was triangulated between 3 properties that had been in the Kellerman family, the same estate whose auction Marin had attended in March. The Kellerman heirs had been trying to sell the remaining ground since 2018. They had 312 acres in 3 parcels across the southeast corner of the county. It was decent ground, not prime, but honest, and it had been cash rented out for years. The asking price was $4,200 an acre, which for 312 acres came to roughly $3 million. It had been on the market for 14 months without a committed offer. Keith Borman had looked at it. So had 2 other operators. The ground was fine. The price wasn't moving. What Marin had noticed, had been noticing since she started walking that ground as a child with Raymond Hollis, was the drainage. The southeast quarter of the Kellerman property had a natural channel running along its edge that fed into the creek. Raymond had written about it in 2011. He'd written, "Whoever controls that channel controls the runoff for 4 farms, including mine." He'd written, if they ever tile that properly, they'll add 15 bushels per acre to the south parcel. He'd written, nobody's done it, because nobody's looked. Nobody had looked. Marin had, though. She'd walked it in 2020 with a topographic map she'd downloaded from the USTA Web Soil Survey and a set of soil probes she'd borrowed from the University of Tennessee Extension Office. She'd done the math. 15 bushels per acre on the south parcel, maybe 12 on the east quarter. Add the drainage tile. She'd gotten 2 contractor quotes, and the cost came to $38,000 for the south parcel and $51,000 for the east. Against the yield improvement over 10 years at average corn prices and a conservative estimate, the net gain ran to somewhere between $280,000 and $340,000. She'd written it in her notebook. She had her grandfather's habit. In the spring of 2022, she was 20 then, and had been working and saving and renting a small herd of Angus cattle on shares from Dale, The Kellerman heirs reduced their ask to $3,800 an acre and still did not sell. The listing went stale. One of the heirs, a woman in Nashville who had inherited her portion from her father, stopped returning calls from real estate agents. Marin contacted her directly. She made an offer. It was not the highest offer the family had received. It was $3,600 an acre for the two parcels she wanted, the south and east parcels, 201 combined acres, which came to $723,600. What she offered that nobody else had was a 90-day close with no financing contingency. Cash? She had assembled it from her own savings, a loan from Dale, and a private investor, Walt Presley, who had driven down from Rutherford County to have coffee with her one morning in February, and had spent 2 hours looking at her notebook and her soil maps and her drainage quotes and her yield projections. Walt Presley did not lend money to people usually. He was 68 years old and had seen enough bad loans and enough families to know better. He did not know exactly why he agreed. He told Ray Cochran later that she reminded him of his father. Not how she looked, just the notebook. Just the way she used it. The sale closed in June of 2022. On the day Marin Hollis signed the papers in a lawyer's office in Manchester, Keith Borman was farming the North Kellerman parcel on a cash rent lease that expired the following year. He found out about the sale through his landlord. He found out who the buyer was on his own. He did not come to any conclusions out loud. He was not that kind of man. He just drove home on County Road 47 past the cattle guard that was still loose, and he thought about the March Saturday 3 years earlier when he had said something quiet to the man beside him at a sale where a girl in an oversized jacket bid $25 on a broken auger. He didn't say anything to anybody about it. There wasn't anything to say. Walt Presley told Ray Cochran the whole story in December of 2022. Over the fence that ran between their properties. He told it straight, without ornament. He said the thing he kept coming back to was the notebook. He said Raymond Hollis had died 6 years before that girl walked into the Kellerman sale, and she still walked in there carrying what he knew. He was quiet for a while. The fence between them was a good fence, 5-wire barbed, posts set right. Raymond Hollis would have approved of it. Walt said he didn't know what you called that. A person carrying something forward from someone who was gone. He said he wasn't sure there was a word for it. There might not be. But there's a name for the thing that makes it possible, which is that some people pay attention and write it down and don't stop. The rest is just patience.